something in America feels unstable, not loud, not sudden, but structural. Every day, the public conversation spins around culture wars, political identity, and partisan outrage. Those conflicts dominate headlines, social media, and cable news. Yet, they distract from a quieter force that has been reshaping the country for decades. While millions of Americans struggle to keep pace with rising costs, a narrow segment of society has steadily accumulated control over the nation's wealth, and with it, its institutions. This didn't happen through a single policy or one administration. It unfolded gradually through incentives, loopholes, and power that compounded over time. One way to see it clearly is to visualize who actually owns America. If the country were divided by wealth instead of geography, the poorest 20% would control an area no larger than Arizona. That would mean tens of millions of people reduced to a single state's worth of economic power. The next 60%, the broad middle, would stretch across the West Coast, from Washington to California. Everything else would belong to the wealthiest 20%. And inside that group, the richest 1% alone would dominate enough wealth to cover the entire East Coast. That level of concentration didn't exist for most of American history. For much of the 20th century, the United States promoted itself as a place where progress felt attainable, not guaranteed, but realistic. Effort translated into improvement. Wages rose alongside productivity. Each generation expected to live better than the last. That expectation has eroded. Over the past 40 years, incomes at the very top have exploded. The top 1% did not simply pull ahead. Their earnings surged by 574%, multiplying nearly six-fold. Over the same period, incomes for the bottom 20% increased by only 30%, barely enough to stay even with inflation. The result wasn't just a gap, it was a separation. Today, political movements often promise a return to a lost golden age. Donald Trump built an entire campaign around that idea. But the nostalgia isn't really about social norms or old hierarchies. What people miss is stability, predictability, the feeling that effort still mattered. Because inequality isn't only an economic problem, it's a power problem. When wealth concentrates, influence follows. Over time, those with resources shape policy, rewrite incentives, and insulate themselves from consequences. The American dream did not disappear. It became inaccessible. To understand how this happened, you have to rewind to a period when inequality actually moved in the opposite direction. After World War II, the United States entered one of the most prosperous eras in its history. Economic growth surged, industrial production expanded, and wages rose. Families bought homes, and entire suburbs appeared almost overnight. Between the late 1940s and the early 1970s, the United States economy doubled in size. That pace rivals the growth of modern China. More importantly, the gains were widely shared. During this period, inequality fell sharply. By the 1940s, the share of income held by the top 10% dropped to its lowest level in over a century. The middle class expanded at a historic rate. By the 1960s, roughly 60% of Americans fell into that category, compared to just 30% before the Great Depression. Consumer goods once reserved for elites became common. Cars, televisions, appliances, living standards rose steadily. The system, while flawed, delivered upward movement for most people. By the late 1970s, a new economic philosophy gained dominance. Neoliberalism argued that government intervention slowed growth. Markets, left alone, would allocate resources more efficiently. Lower taxes, lighter regulation, and global trade would unlock prosperity. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, that philosophy became policy. The top marginal tax rate fell from around 70% to roughly 30%. Regulations were rolled back. Trade barriers were dismantled. Capital flowed freely across borders. Measured by raw output, the strategy appeared successful. Since the early 1980s, the United States has posted strong economic growth compared to other developed nations. Early on, Americans earned about $12,000 more per year than Europeans. By 2023, that gap expanded to $31,000. Yet beneath those numbers, the economic experience of ordinary Americans stalled. From the 1940s through the 1970s, income growth for the bottom 90% closely tracked overall economic growth. After the 1970s, that link broke. Wages flattened. Productivity gains no longer translated into paychecks. So where did the growth go? Upward. While gross domestic product tripled and markets surged, the benefits concentrated at the top. The middle class did not collapse suddenly. It thinned gradually, year after year. The indicators policymakers relied on still looked healthy. Gross domestic product climbed. The stock market rose more than 1,400%. Unemployment stayed relatively low, but lived experience told a different story. Costs increased faster than wages. Job security weakened. Debt replaced income growth. Capitalism stopped delivering shared progress. That breakdown shows up most clearly in mobility. Someone born into the bottom 10% of earners today has only a 7% chance of reaching the top 10%. Americans born in the 1940s had a 90% chance of earning more than their parents. For those born in the 1980s, that probability fell to 50%. Opportunity narrowed. Public frustration followed. In 2024, reducing inequality ranked as one of the top concerns voters wanted addressed. Historically, issues with that level of support forced government action. Inequality proved different. Despite widespread agreement on the problem, policy response stalled. The reason lies in how power operates. Surveys show Americans believe the top 20% should own roughly 30% of the nation's wealth, with the rest distributed broadly. In reality, almost all wealth sits at the top, while the bottom barely registers. That mismatch fuels anger, but anger alone does not override influence. Modern politics makes this visible. At major political events, elected officials share space with corporate executives and billionaire donors. Their presence reflects leverage. In 2024, the world's 100 wealthiest families contributed $2.6 billion to political campaigns. Total presidential spending reached $5.12 billion. More than half came from elite donors. Campaigns now depend on wealth. Policy follows dependency. Chief executive officer pay illustrates the outcome. In the 1980s, chief executive officers earned roughly 31 times the average worker's pay. Today, that figure stands near 290 times. The increase did not reflect productivity, it reflected changed incentives. Compensation shifted toward stock-based rewards and financial engineering. Worker wages stagnated. Even when reform is discussed, wealth has grown increasingly difficult to tax. Capital mobility transformed the system. Money earned in the U.S. no longer stays there. Offshore accounts, shell companies, tax havens, entire financial networks designed to avoid scrutiny. Today, roughly 10% of global GDP sits hidden offshore. Serious taxation efforts trigger capital flight. The system lacks corrective mechanisms. As a result, the bottom half of Americans owns just 2% of the nation's wealth. The top 1% earns 139 times more than the poorest 20%. That imbalance reshapes society itself. Even small increases in inequality correlate with rising polarization. A shift of just 0.1 in the Gini coefficient leads to measurable increases in political division. Since the 1960s, United States inequality has climbed more than 15%. Social trust eroded alongside it. In the 1960s, only 4% of Americans objected to their child marrying someone from the opposing political party. By 2019, that figure rose to 45% among Democrats and 35% among Republicans. Politics hardened into identity. Gridlock became normal. Communities fractured. While attention fixates on cultural battles, wealth continues consolidating. America now faces a choice. Inequality is not inevitable. It results from policy decisions. Higher taxes once existed. Campaign finance once looked different. Other wealthy democracies still provide universal health care, affordable education, and stronger labor protections. Public support already exists. What is missing is the redistribution of power. History shows that extreme inequality eventually forces change. The Gilded Age gave way to reform. The Great Depression produced the New Deal. The open question is not whether the system can change. It is whether change arrives before inequality becomes irreversible. Because if current trends continue, the American dream will not collapse dramatically. It will fade quietly, leaving behind a society that still talks about opportunity long after it stopped delivering it.